Hello, hello.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
We are here.
We did.
We'll wait for people to pop on. All right. We are Country Malt Group. We are here to talk today about using brewing ingredients innovatively, and that's how to get the best or the most out of your specialty grain. Got lots and lots of information coming your way from some really great people. We're going to do some introductions here. Sid, do you want to start us off?
Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Sydney Starkman. I'm a field sales manager in the northeastern U.S. and Canada, and I've been with Country Malt Group for almost 3 years now.
Hello, I am Tim Roberts. I have been at Country Malt for 5 years, and prior to that, I was a professional brewer for 21 years, most recently at Yards in Philadelphia.
My name is Heather Jerred. I am the token Canadian of the group. I'm the Western Canadian Sales Territory Manager. I've been with Country Malt Group just shy of 6 years now.
And I am Patrick Sylvester. I'm the New England Territory Manager for Country Malt Group. I've been here for about 2.5 years. And prior to that, I brewed myself in the Hudson Valley in New York for about 10 years.
And I am Abi Conner. I'm the product manager at Country Malt Group. So I'm in charge of the portfolio management and all the things like that. I've been with Country Malt Group for almost 2 years, coming up here at the beginning of November. I've been brewing for about 6 years commercially and home brewing for about 13 or 14 years. So very excited to be here today with everyone.
I will say the dog in my photo, his name is Frank. And just in case we need to clarify that.
Yeah, I thought about that. All the photos of us, the ladies, all are holding our beers with one hand. And
I'm just
awesome.
My dog might show up on screen at some point in time, so.
Yeah, you're going to probably hear mine too. They're going to bark, I'm sure. All right, a little bit about Country Malt Group. If you don't know who we are a distributor of ingredients. We started about 30 years ago. We're going to be celebrating our birthday at CBC next year, so come hang out with us. Fun fact, we started in a little shed in Brian Béchard's backyard. So if you've been to our CBC booth, you've seen the tiny little shed. That's what it is. So he had bags of grain in that itty-bitty little building, and that's where it started. So in that 30 years, we've grown a lot. We have a lot of really great ingredients for you, a lot of really great employees here for you. We are your one-stop shop for all of your everyday brewing and distilling ingredients. So anything that you need to make a good beverage, we've got it for you. The best part about our business is that you can put it all onto one pallet and it's one price. So put your grain, put your hops, put your flavors, your chemicals, everything on one pallet and it ships to you. We also have a team of really great experts at our company. Everybody you talk to is going to know a great deal of what they're doing, and they're really passionate about what they do. We've got a great sales team, some of which are here today. They are wonderful. They know so much. They're here for your success. We've got technical experts in our Malt Innovation Center, which is in Vancouver, Washington. We have just a lot of really great people there. We have a connection with our ingredient suppliers as well. So if you ever have a question that we can't answer, we are directly connected to our suppliers. If you don't know how to use a chemical or sanitation, or if you have a question about malts, we can go directly to our suppliers and ask them. They're here for you as well. All right, let's get into it.
Let's dive on in. So we are going to talk a bit about specialty malts today and how some tips and tricks of how to use them in your brewery. So just want to kind of start off with discussing what specialty malts are. They are basically not base malts. That could be the end of the presentation right there. So these are the malts that are going to give that added flavor, added color, and in some instances, some added mouthfeel as well. They kind of add dimensions to your beer. So when we're talking about kilned malt, that would be along the lines of your base malts, as well as your Munich and your Vienna. These malts are steeped, then germinated, and then kiln dried, and then sent off to you. We're going to talk a bit more, again, on the specialty side of things. So crystal malts and roasted malts. And these have a few extra steps in them when you're creating them. So crystal malts, you're steeping, you're germinating, and then they're stewed. Sydney's going to touch a little bit on that whole process. And then they are roasted to give the color that we're looking for. And then our roasted malts, again, steep, germination, they're kiln dried, and then off to the roasting drum.
Yep. So with the crystal malts, like Heather said, for the process of making one, you go through the regular germination and steep of the malting process. The wet malt is then moved to a roasting drum or other enclosed system and heated to around 800 to 900 Fahrenheit, or around 410 to 480 Celsius for our Canadian friends. During that process, the endosperm liquefy and the starch is saccharified in a strong alpha and beta amylase action. And then the final or curing stage, the malt is dried at high temps, not quite as high as the previous stages, to around 280 to 390 Fahrenheit, or 140 to 200 Celsius. This darkens the kernels and causes the malt sugars through that process to crystallize into hard, unfermentable dextrins upon cooling. And that's how you get your crystal malt. And these malts can be used for a variety of reasons. They add a nutty-like caramel residual sweetness. They can add color to your finished beer as well, along with head retention and multi-aroma flavor. Depending on the crystal malt you choose, the darker you go, that more red hue will be much more defined in your beer. We at CMG have 23 different crystal malts in our portfolio, ranging from 15 to 150. And below, I've included some inclusion rates that you can use for specific styles. The more that you use of the crystal malts in your grain bill, you're going to get a sweeter flavor and more of that red color hue, depending on the inclusion rate and the level of crystal malt you're using.
Sweet. Yeah. So when it comes to innovation, I think when it comes to specialty malt in general, we're seeing a lot of innovation come in this world. One of which that I think is probably one of the coolest ones is caramel steam. So it's similar to your normal crystal malts. The only difference here is that saccharification stage, that heating, is done through with a little bit of a presence of steam. So the germ bin and the kiln are actually double suited, right? So it can convert to one another. And they introduced a gentle amount of steam. This is going to provide a much more gentle crystallization, a little bit of more of softer, less astringent style of sweetness than your typical, kind of hard caramel with that kind of robust toffee kind of style of flavor, right? Caramel steam, you can use it for any of your low color crystal malts. You can sub 1 for 1 on that. So ours currently from Great Western comes in about a 35 to 45 range of SRM. It brings forward a sort of lighter note of graham cracker, softer caramel, slight nutty. And again, it's much more gentler than your typical crystal malt that we're seeing. And honestly, out in market, we are seeing a rise of West Coast IPAs and things like that. So that we're seeing brewers trend back into a more specialty-based grist. But I don't think that we're all the way back into, say, like a 2005 range, right? So we're coming back towards sweetness, but we want to kind of dip our toe into it and kind of go in gently. There are avenues for us to continuously explore caramel steam. So right now, while we have the 40, we're not opposed to working on accomplishing maybe a 20 or a crystal 10, or maybe even on the higher side, a 60 or an 80. So pretty neat, sort of innovation that we're seeing out of that to kind of fit the new market of consumers that we're seeing. We can go to the next slide. And this one's also me. Along with that, out in the market, we're noticing that a lot of folks are trending more towards the importance of what I call body dynamic grains. Yeah, I found out that people don't use that phrase. So
Nobody uses that phrase.
It's going to be huge. Honestly, I think that you guys will be all right. But what I define as body dynamic grains are these specialty grains that are sort of unsung heroes. They're sort of quiet partners in there, but they help build on foam, haze stability, both of which have become more and more important for what the consumer wants and what brewers kind of struggle with, right? So one of those type of body dynamic grain is going to be your dextrin malts. This is actually accomplished by just under-modifying the malt to a pretty ridiculous effect, right? So by under-modifying, when it moves into the germ bin, where your normal malts, your kiln malts will probably take about 24 to 48 hours of germination, your dextrin malts will sit there for about 6 hours, right? So a significant chunk of time lost there. What this is doing is it's retaining a lot of those higher molecular weight polysaccharides. These are things like proteins, your beta glucans, and things like that. And those are going to be left behind in your beer, hence building on your foam or your sort of haze in your body that the beer is coming from. Now, what's cool about dextrin malt is that modification is directly related to color, right? The more you modify malt, the more color that malt will pick up during the process. So when you have an under-modified malt, even similar to like your Pilsners, the modification is so low, so it allows it to be a very low color malt. So for instance, we have Great Western Dexter Pils as well as Breeze Cara Pils. And you can add these into your beers, your grists, without really anybody noticing, right? For something like a Dexter malt, I'd stick around 5%. It should get the job done. And you'll see better foam and haze stability kind of down the line. Now, similar to that, but a little bit different, we have a massively growing popularity in chip malt. So chip malt is sort of like a cult following. For those that know about it, they love it, and it works a lot. It works very well for their beers. The way that this differs is that through the steeping process, it goes through that normal process, and then instead of transferring to a germ bin, there's a small amount of germination that happens, but it pretty much goes directly to the kiln. So it's a much closer product to raw barley than a dextrin malt is. And this is going to accomplish a very similar amount of the same things as your dextrin malt. So again, leaving behind a lot of those unfermentables, your polysaccharides, your beta glucans and proteins and things like that. This will give you a lower S to T ratio or your Kolbach index. And that's going to go ahead and build upon those proteins that you want to be kicking around to build that haze and build that stability there. This is a great remedy for over attenuation without adding too much cloying sweetness. So especially if you're making your hazy IPAs and you're finding, you want it to be ending somewhere around 3 Plato, 3.5 Plato, and it's your yeast is kind of taking it a little bit too far. This is a great recommendation to test out and taking in chip malt and seeing if it can get you back up to where you need to be without adding too much cost, but also without adding too much sweetness that a normal specialty malt would do. A little bit of history. The reason why chip malt was created was because of the German purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, and it was a more natural way to accomplish this sort of dextrin that kind of sticks around and these non-fermentables. Right? Kind of need that. And I've seen guys start to use chip malt upwards of 15%, so it's really getting up there in terms of popularity. And then last but not least, when we're talking about body dynamic grains, as funny as that. We can't not talk about flaked barley, flaked oats, and flaked wheat. Heather's going to be talking a little bit about our specialty flaking facility, but these are essentially the same concept, right? They're unmalted going into the flaking process. It leaves behind a good amount of non-fermentables for stable haze and head retention. And again, I'm in New England. Guys are using 20%, 30% of flake products in their beers to get where they need to be for that.
Yeah, I would actually like to start my single slide with some apologies. First of all, this is unfortunately going to be my only single slide. Second of all, I hope it's not a problem if there's some reiteration of information that you've already heard, if I'm too verbose. And also, I've heard that I've already differed with one of my colleagues, but I'm sure all that will shake out in the extensive question and answer segment that we'll have later on.
We're not allowed to
as
fight,
you can
guys.
see, that's some very gentle encouragement on my part, and we would love to have you guys ask questions as I go. Please raise your hand, or at the end we can also talk about it. So as you can see, my first thing I'd like to talk about in terms of roasted malts is flavor versus color. So to me, the color part of it is a very simple equation, right? We can all read the SRM chart, we can all do the calculation and figure out how that's going to impact the final beer. That's simple, but what I would like to leave everyone with today is that color is not simple, or the equation's not simple in terms of flavor. There's actually a huge difference in how those malts are made and the impact of the flavor of the malts, right? Black malt and roasted barley and chocolate malt, in the grand scheme of things, are fairly close to the same SRM, but in terms of the flavor characteristics, they all are night and day, as I'm sure we can all understand. And I would also like to suggest that the SRM is sort of a standard calculation, but we all need to pay attention to our individual equipment and how it relates to individual, in terms of the other parts of the building blocks of the beer. And I think that's something I'll keep coming back to because I think it's ultimately super important. The classic flavor characteristics of roasted malts are coffee and chocolate, but I would also add maybe something that that people think is sort of a negative connotation, but a huge part of roasted malts, and that's astringency. But we'll talk a little bit about that to come. So in wine, astringency is not a dirty word, but in beer, it typically is. And for brewers, the fear is that we're going to leach tannins off of the malt either by over-sparging, by sparging with pH or with water that's too high a pH, or with water that's too high in temperature. But I would suggest that is also a tool that you can use with the roasted malts. It's not, we can all understand that the end result and what we're going for is the overall beer and how it all relates. And so sometimes astringency is exactly what you want. And that comes with recipe, that relates to recipe formulation. Do you want to use dark malts to augment some of the hop bitterness instead of actual hop bitterness? Is there a difference? Is there a pleasant level to that astringency? And most importantly, I think, is how all of this relates to residual sugar. But again, that's up to the individual brewer for sure. I'd also like to talk about, the production of, in terms of drum roasting versus the kiln. And I don't know how, if everyone's aware of this, but like Sydney said, crystal malts and roasted malts are typically made in the kiln, in the drum roaster, and then more typical, including base malts, are made in the kiln rather. So again, that goes back to the intent, the stringency, how much is that, how much is that part how much of that is a part of your final beer. And then just from a nuts and bolts standpoint, the roasting drums are much more consistent. They're a much shorter period of time. They have higher airflow and higher temperatures, whereas kilns take longer. They have typically longer batches, and just the natural airflow and the mixing of itself make them less homogeneous. And of course, the elephant in the room here is, we can talk about IPAs, black IPAs or Cascadian dark ales, and also about how the Germans absolutely love to have debittered, dehusked, and dark malts with very, very little astringency, whether they're useful to you as a brewer or not. And so removing the husk, of course, removes the astringency. And in fact, Best Malts has introduced a drum roasting technique whereby the actual drum never comes in contact with the heat source. And so the goal there is color without astringency, and arguably color without character. And I think the question is, and this is again the question for the individual brewer, is that possible? And maybe most importantly, is that desirable? I'd also like to talk about grist percentages. And I think with dark malts, it's fairly straightforward. With these very, very highly roasted malts, 3 to 5% is a fairly typical standard about what you can get away with, but you can definitely overdo it, again, especially with dark malts. Just sort of an aside, and again, for the question and answer segment, the robust question and answer segment we're about to embark on, I have over my years learned a little ratio, and I'll throw it out there, and I wonder if any of the other brewers have understood this or maybe found it themselves, is that to me, 8 parts medium crystal, 4 parts chocolate malt, 2 parts roasted barley, and 1 part black malt is what I have found in my brewing career, sort of a golden ratio. The next period I have, and I've touched on it before, is that there's more than one way to skin a black cat, right? And maybe I'm belaboring the point, but I'd specifically like to point out again how important it is. The SRM does not sum it up, because all we care about really, we care about costs and we care about throughput, and we care about efficiencies and all that stuff, but really, and I think some people lose this when we're talking about beer and all those other kind of nuances, is that the flavor of the beer is really all that matters, right? So the SRM, of course, is important, but more importantly is how those different black malt or dark malts work for you. Do you want to use crystal for the color? Do you want to use black malt? So on and so forth. And I think what we all can, it never hurts to remember, is that we all need to taste our beer.
Tim, I think, not to cut you off, but before we move on past this point, I think it's interesting when you look at SRM values, and you can see it in our catalog too as well. On the dark malts, the range is vast, and that just goes to show that it's sort of not as definitive as a estimate as much as the flavor that comes with the malt itself, right? So you can have a black malt that ranges from 200 to 400, right? And it's got to fall within that range. And so that goes to show that you got to select based off of flavor, not necessarily plug and play based off of color.
Yeah, definitely. That was actually something, we just had a podcast on all of our roasted malts, and I went through, they asked me to go through the portfolio of our roasted malts, and I think it took me like 20 minutes because it was just very extensive. We have a lot of different colors to choose from, and it's, you can do a lot with it.
Right, absolutely. And I think, again, if we're talking about flavor, and there's going to be a slide highlighting the hot steep method, which is, of course, very, very important. And of course, particularly with these malts, no one wants to chew, black malt, right? You're not going to really assess any difference other than ruining your palate for the rest of the day. So I think that's just something to, to call out in advance, that it's very, very important. I would also, of course, like to talk about roasted versus crystal malt, which I touched on earlier, as did Sydney. But, I look at kind of crystal malts as almost like a hybrid, right? And because they're basically on their way to becoming, a base malt, right? And then there's this extra stage called stewing, right? And that's sort of, at least in my way of thinking, is what makes crystal malts what they are. It's the stewing of, the hydrating of the roast, and points allowing this to convert to a certain point to unlock the sugars, which of course, if you talk about crystallization and the Maillard reaction and all that stuff, really that's what we're talking about. And so they're stewed at lower temp, or they're stewed rather, first of all, and then they're dried at lower temperatures in the drum roaster, say about 150 degrees. And what that does is it fully liquefies the starches into full amounts of sugars. And then when they raise the temperature, and now here's where Sydney and I differ, it's my understanding it's only 300 degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe Sydney and I will cage match that later, I'm not sure, but and what that does is it crystallizes those sugars, and that's really what makes crystal malt, when you look at it in the bag and you taste it, it has that sort of mottled effect, right, where there's darker parts. And that's where that comes from, which I think is what makes it a very unique malt and adds so much character and nuance to that malt. Whereas roasted malts all see drum temperatures over 400 degrees, and those higher temperatures really degrade the starches, so there's no protein necessary, and it also creates those coffee and chocolate flavors that I mentioned before. And the last point on my slide is styles. And I think we all know porters and stouts and black IPAs and all that stuff. And obviously the color in those beers And a lot of the character in those beers comes from these different kinds of malts that we've been talking about. But I also would like to point out that these malts have the potential and are very often used in brewing in very small quantities just to add nuance to the color. I've certainly brewed beer, as probably many of us have, that have just a tiny little bit of roasted barley just to add that golden color to what is, otherwise, say 100% Turo or 100% Pilsner grist. And we all, of course, know Scotch ales, which are classically 2% roasted barley. So, again, going back to the calculation of color is pretty straightforward. But I think it's good to start looking at, again, different ways to skin that cat, different ways to get that color without necessarily gaining character, or in gaining character in a totally different way.
Tim, we could have gave you more slides, bud.
Well, I clearly like to talk, and so maybe next time around.
Yeah, you weren't limited to one slide.
No.
A lot of information. That's great. Yeah, so there was a lot of talk that Tim was said, and obviously it's a great segue into this in terms of talking about the different ways that you can skin that cat, right? Different ways that you can accomplish it. And I think now more than ever, right, out in market, there's just a lot of the same product, right? There's a lot of the same beer. There's a lot of redundancy out there. And so we find a lot of brewers that are investing in R&D programs and things like that to make sure that they're differentiating themselves, that they're making something that's a little bit different than somebody else. And a couple of things that you can take away from this, or the way that you can lean on your specialty malt, is similar to what Tim said, right? Incorporating a very small percentage, 1% to 2%, maybe even less, of black malt, chocolate malt, or roasted barley. And you can accomplish that sort of golden color without the sort of stereotypical chocolate flavors that come through, right? Everybody's stout kind of tastes the same. Everybody's porter tastes the same. But maybe you want to get that sort of neutral Pils base, but a little bit of an amber for maybe a Palatomavi Czech lager, right? Great way to express these specialty malts and kind of accomplish what you need to. On the opposite side of that, you can do a higher percentage of black malts to accomplish that dark color if you are doing these, stouts and porters or dark ales or Cascadian IPAs and whatnot. But then take the opportunity to build in something that's not as typical, right? You can layer in some lighter crystal malts. There's things that aren't necessarily going to be attributed to your typical dark beers, right? Maybe a honey malt built into there and allow it to shine. I think there needs to be a lot of experimentation into this. We see a lot of breweries going back to the wide array and portfolios of beers. And like I said, I think there needs to be a lot of differentiation coming out of some of the beers that we're having, because the market needs it right now. You need to be something different, not just better than the next guy, so to speak. Yeah, and then also, me and Tim should have done this at the same time. But we're seeing, in terms of innovation or some new malts that are coming our way, this idea of the astringency that comes from husks and tannins, right? So we're seeing a lot more development in these huskless roasted and specialty options. One that's kind of catches my eye is that when we recently just brought on Castle Malting. Castle Malting has a vast SKU portfolio of specialty malts, right? So they have about like 100 different specialty malts or something like that. And a lot of that is diving into the specialty wheat world. Brice also has been doing a lot of innovation in this world too as well, but wheat is naturally huskless, right? So you're able to have that expected color, the flavor performance that comes out of those, but without that sort of roasted characteristic that you get from husks. Again, sometimes it's wanted, sometimes it's warranted, but other times it's not. So just another level of innovation that's out there for that. I will also just throw a caveat out there for techniques and applications that I typically leave or always left my crystal malt usage below 10%. I think it gets the point across without having to be too cloyingly sweet. And obviously that depends based off the beer that you're trying to accomplish. But it can also negatively impact your pH, right? It can make it a little bit more acidic. And too much crystal malts can in turn impact your fermentation down the line. So if you find yourself that you're hitting that threshold, that 10% threshold of your grist, maybe consider using a Munich or Vienna or maybe some pale malts to kind of build in some more flavor on that one. And then last but not least, again, being in New England, I troubleshoot a lot of haze stability questions, right? And the haze, when it comes to adjuncts and things like that, there needs to be a better understanding of the proteins that are being accessed and what they're doing for your beer. This is something that a lot of guys have a hard time wrapping their head around, and there's a lot of industry knowledge that might not be totally encompassing. But the best way to think about it is that if you look at, let's say a wheat, right? And you have the protein that's in wheat. Well, if that wheat has been malted, that protein is still pretty much there, but it's been kind of chopped up, right? It's been beaten up a little bit and shorter protein particles from that. What that's going to result in is a pretty stable haze, very, homogeneous and thrown throughout, but it's not going to be as turbid as some guys want it to be. Like some of these guys are looking for these really, really hazy beers. And so for that, if you're looking for that, I would rely on a lot of the unmalted aspects, your torrefied wheats, your flaked oats, things like that, when it hasn't been processed, where that long protein chain is still totally intact. And this is going to give you that thicker protein, that thicker haze that you want, but it's not as shelf stable. All right, so we're seeing a lot of guys with IPAs sitting on the shelves for more than 2 months. They'll struggle with haze stability falling out, or haze dropping out, rather. So it's just sort of an understanding of your specialty malts and your adjuncts that you're using, and sort of building a grist that kind of fits the beer and its needs, right? If you're going to sell it through the tap room in under 2 weeks, go ahead and load that thing up with flaked oats and torrefied wheat. If you're trying to go out into distribution, into market, and you want to have a haze that's there, but also still there 6 months down the line, consider a blend of unmalted or flaked products, as well as malt wheat, wheat malt or dextrin malts and things like that. So again, just understanding what each of those kind of bring to the table is going to be really beneficial to having a consistent product out in market.
Hey, Patrick.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I interject here, even though it has nothing at all to do with roasted malts?
Tim, I would.
So we were talking about haze, as Patrick does like to talk about quite a bit. And it's something actually I learned since starting this job by a very smart maltster, someone who knows much more about malt than me. And it's that, all proteins are not the same. I think we can all understand that. There's different chains, there's different types, there's different, all kinds of different proteins. And that, I spent 20 years trying to make beer clear, and now we're all trying to make beer hazy. But I think the variety, what this maltster taught me is that the variety of proteins can really get you to where you want. And there's not some golden ratio or a certain formula for it, but that if you use, different types, like you're saying, flaked oats, say, and malted wheat and all that kind of stuff, that you're just kind of throwing everything at it. And by throwing everything at it, you have a greater chance of adding or, forming a stable haze, which I think is that's kind of the gold standard now. Right. Everyone wants a haze that lasts forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks for interjecting, Tim. I really appreciate it.
Just know more about things than just roasted malt.
Yeah.
Speaking of haze stability, so we want to touch a little bit on our flaked adjuncts. Obviously, adjuncts aren't necessarily just flaked products, but these are the ones we're going to talk about a bit today, as these are the ones Canada Malting is producing. Currently, we have the flaked wheat, flaked oats, flaked rye, and flaked barley being produced in Calgary, Alberta. We do have flaked maize as well as flaked rice in our catalog as well, just not with this brand right now. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the facility. I guess I put that at the end, but before we jump into talking about it. So this is opened in 2023. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Abby.
2023. Yep.
2023. Yep. I was there when it opened. I just can't remember that far back. So this was really born out of this need to be able to have better control over our products and our quality and our supply chain. This was all being done by a third party. Now we've brought it all on site, site in Calgary. And all of these products are sourced from the Canadian prairies. So there's a reason our malt house is in Calgary. That's where we're getting a lot of these products from, most of these products from, as well as in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So we have multiple ways of producing these products in the facility. So we do steam cooking, which is exactly what it sounds like, and then direct heat cooking as well. So the process is we do have to do some sort of pre-processing with raw products. You can just throw some of them in there, but you probably don't want to just crush up some rye and throw it into your beer. So we do have to do a bit of pre-processing. So we do heat and moisture is used to disrupt the starch crystals that are within the grain. And then that grain then moves through, I guess, the flaking. It's basically 2 rollers, and it rolls right in there and it flakes it out for you. Then it's dried to about 12% moisture, put in a bag and sent to you. So again, we really saw an insurgence of obviously wheat and oats coming in on the flaked side when everybody really wanted a hazy IPA, and everybody still really wants a hazy IPA since they're all still very much out there in the market. So these provide some haze stability and head retention, which is great, but they are also giving a lot of some of that really great mouthfeel, some of that creaminess that you want. So there's also great additions into things such as like an oatmeal stout.
I will say that, just to add on to that, if I may, Heather,
No.
that kind of funny coming onto the malt side of things in the brewing world is that flaked products in general were primarily driven for the baking market, right? They're primarily made for bakers. Some of the larger companies, that's where they geared towards. And so it's kind of a rarity for Canada Malting to be one of the maltsters that owns their own flaking facility alongside of their base malt production, and allows us to like really dial it in for brewer specs, that being a rolled oat with larger kernels for better lagerability, better efficiency. You know, we can actually even dial in the thickness of the oat as we test the sort of balance between extract and usability onto it. So just a sort of another level of innovation that's happening at the plant to better suit the brewers out that are, you know, out in market right now.
Mm-hmm. And bringing it in-house also helps us control the price on it as well.
Yes, I was going to make that point as well. Yep.
A lot more cost effective.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody loves that, especially right now.
So I think we've touched upon it a couple times, or maybe Tim was talking about it. I find it interesting that, you know, for a lot of small breweries, a lot of guys don't necessarily practice the hot steep method. And again, when it comes to innovation in specialty malt, I think it's something that we want more brewers to kind of buy into this practice. This was actually developed by Brees and the ASBC, and it's renowned as like a good enough practice to really get an understanding of your specialty malt, and the flavors that are going to come through it, right? And so outside of just your normal standard and chew, this is going to allow you to sort of access the flavors, the aromatics, and the color that a specialty malt might be able to produce, as well as do little mini mashes to understand your grist, to see how it's going to play. Because honestly, you know, there's so much innovation going out there. A 20-barrel batch of beer can result in, you know, it's a few $1,000s worth of product. So that's a pretty big risk to test something, right? And so doing this process can allow for a lot of guys to make an educated decision before diving, you know, headfirst into your specialty malt. You don't need much to get it done. It's pretty inexpensive equipment. So you'll need a scale, a grinder, like a coffee grinder or something like that, funnel, filter paper or coffee filters, beaker, thermos, graduated cylinder, and a hot water kettle, and/or most breweries have access to hot water ready to go. To walk everybody through, the process is you take 50 grams of coarsely milled malt. So it's going to be different than your typically milled malt. You're going to grind it a little bit closer to flour, but still not all the way there. You're going to take 400 milliliters of hot water, 149 degrees Fahrenheit. Heather can help me out, whatever that is in Celsius. I don't speak Canadian. And we'll take the two of them and you combine them in the furnace. You just shake it up. That wasn't a dig, Heather, I promise. You combine it in the thermos and you shake it up. You wait 15 minutes, and essentially you're creating a little single infusion mash, just kind of as quick as possible. After 15 minutes is up, you swirl it around just to kind of loosen everything back into suspension, and then you pour it into the funnel over the filter. You collect those first 100 milliliters worth of wort runoff, and you dump that back on top of the funnel to recirculate that. This is essentially your little mini Verloff that you'd be going through. At the end of it, you'll collect about 200 milliliters worth of wort. And from that, you can do taste and sensory and kind of run through exactly what that malt is providing, what kind of flavors you can anticipate from it, and how you can dial it in terms of usage on your beer. So again, 15 minutes, probably about $60 worth of total equipment to have on hand, but it's really not too big of an investment and something that is a better practice for most brewers to kind of get into. Now, if you're evaluating a light colored specialty malt by itself, you don't really want to do 100% of it. You'll do a 50-50 split. So 50% of the 50 grams, 25 grams would be that light colored specialty malt. 25 grams would be your typical base malt, whether it be Pils or two-row. If you're doing a dark colored malt, you're going to want to dial that back even further. As Tim mentioned, you don't really want to blow your palate out with these dark roasted malts. So at that point, you do a 15-85 ratio on that. And as I mentioned, this can actually be done for your exact grist. So if you want to see how that's going to play out, again, we're talking hot wort here, so don't expect it to taste like a finished product. But to see how it's going to play out in a real life scenario, you can mimic your grist ratios too on that one as well. So.
Yeah, you can save yourself some time and money on this and just ask us for samples if you want to buy some sensory on some of the specialty malts that we offer. Like we said, we have a ton of them. So
that's the purpose of those little 3-ounce packets that everybody picks up at the trade shows. And God, I know I was the worst when you pick them up and they never made it to anywhere significant back in the breweries. So, but again, as we see this revitalization of specialty malt and sort of the need to create new innovative beers that are out there in terms of stylistically, you're going to want to make sensible decisions, right? You're going to want to, you can do this to evaluate suppliers as well. You can do this to evaluate crop years. It's not limited to just specialty malt, right? You can do it on two-row or your base malts and see how we're performing and making sure your maltster is, keeping in check with their quality specs that you're anticipating from them.
Yeah, and as we're moving into new crop inclusion, as the new crop has come off, it is a good idea to do it as the new year comes in.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, it's a good practice to adopt, and I'm sometimes surprised of those that aren't using it, and why not, right? Why put yourself up for that risk? So
and Patrick's really good at it. So if anybody wants Patrick to,
I'll fly anywhere you want. I got my little kit and everything.
He shows up with the briefcase.
Yeah.
Well, this is just a nice infographic of what you do, and that's pretty cool. And I just wanted to talk about the portfolio, touch base. We've talked about it multiple times. Our extensive portfolio. We're the one-stop shop. We have your everyday brewing needs, but we also try to get ingredients that are innovative, to help you expand your portfolio, expand your tap room. We have a lot of new ingredients coming in from Castle. Patrick, I believe, had spoken on a little bit. Their roasting facility, their wheats and everything. We've got some new ones coming from them, so keep an eye out. We make sure that our ingredients are quality, but also we want fun new things as well. So check those out. We've got samples of all of them. If you ever want to do hot steep, hit us up. We've got around 1,000 SKUs. So we've got a lot of things to choose from for brewing, distilling, beyond beer, if you're looking to expand your tap room at all. We've got some really cool new and upcoming things. CBC, we've got some launches that you're going to want to come check out. We've got chemicals and sanitation coming in, distilling and beyond beer ingredients. If you don't know what beyond beer is, it's anything beyond the beer. So with distilling, RTDs, seltzers, things like that. We've got some enzymes coming in. We've got some low color malts coming in that are pretty innovative. And then some domestic malt options to be wallet friendly as well. So lots of great things to check out.
Yeah, I know. Oh, sorry, not to cut you off. I was just going to say that I think for the last maybe the last decade, right, we've seen a ton of innovation on the hop side of things. There's been a lot of products coming out of their way, new varietals, things like that. And I think we're going to hit a new era of malt innovation, right? I think it's going to be the next frontier. A lot of guys are going to be asking for it, especially as we see the rise of lagers and, like I said, some more clear beers and things like that, or more traditional styles. I would anticipate more development in products. So as long as people have good practices of how to vet them and how to test them, how they're going to fall into their beers, it's something that you might want to start putting some effort in to sort of understand that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I know we've got comments, a comment section here. If you have any questions for us, whether it be about roasted malts or portfolio, any processes, throw them into the comments. I'm not seeing any quite yet, so we will maybe move on to some extra slides that we have for y'all.
Bonus material.
Yeah, it's fun stuff. We're excited about it.
This is good. Yeah. So I wanted to include this in the slideshow just because it's hard to talk about, or we not be doing our jobs if we talk about malt innovation, but don't talk about the innovation that we're seeing out of barley. And now this is a pretty loaded topic. It's a very big topic. So I'm going to give like a 10,000 foot view onto it. But the fact of the matter is that we're in a very different growing climate than we were 10, 15, 20 years from now. We're seeing a lot of different stressors on the barley market. And there's been a lot of innovation that's happening in the fields to make sure that we're secured and protected from that. So this slide is just a viewage of the seeded acreage of barley that we're seeing in Canada, right? This downward trend of we're losing crop share to some certain things, right? As climate has gotten more unpredictable, barley is a pretty finicky crop to grow, right? So a lot of farmers are finding the risk to be too great to even try and grow malting barley, while we're seeing pressures from other cereal grains, things like oats, wheat, and canola, right? And so we're seeing this decrease in seeded acreage. And as brewers, we need to make sure, and as maltsters, we need to make sure that there's enough product and enough cereal crop for us to supply the industry, right? So there's been a lot of innovation and a lot of work done to vet some new varietals that are working their way into the field. You can actually go to the next slide if you'd like, Abby. So if you know anything about farmers, change doesn't come quick for them, right? It takes about 10 years to develop a new barley varietal, similar to that of a hop. It takes a lot of effort to do it, and then to get it to be bought into by all the farmers, it's a long, steady process, right? And so if you look at this graph here on the right side, that velocity of the increase of seed acreage that we're seeing, that should go to show of how important this information is and this work that's being done for this research on new varietals. We're seeing a massive decline or shying away of growing of Copeland and Metcalf. These are your two long-term staples. These barley varieties have been a long-standing sort of the go-to for a long time for farmers, right? And they've been used as the barometer to judge new barley varietals against, right? So as we're seeing a change in climate, we're selecting things that are better suited for Fusarium head blight, lodging, net blotch, and disease. And they're all going through this selected process. So as we're seeing that Copeland and Metcalf are coming away, we're seeing an increase in varietals like Connect and Synergy, Sirish, and one of the ones that's becoming getting a lot of buzz is Churchill. Maltsters love it. They grow better. They're better suited to the climate that we have, here and now. And it's going to be better for the brewer all in all, right? The better they grow, the more homogeneous that we get into the malt house, the better product that we can produce coming through. And actually, if we go to the next slide, the biggest takeaway is that we're fighting against that decrease in seed acreage, right? So this graph here is a trajectory of the yield per acre that we've seen over the last 20 years. And this coincides with the adoption of these new varietals, right? So we're seeing metric tons per hectare, grow from 2.6 to about 3.6, right? We're making more out of the acreage that we still have, right? And this is incredibly important when it comes to farmers and agriculture and for securing our supply for future years. So just some really cool information on this front. I'm happy to talk to anybody if you want to drop your contact information in the chat. Talk about this further because I can go blue on this topic. And now, so we talk about that as Canada Malting. We have to be sustainable in our practices because it's obviously important for the future ahead. And so we're adopting a lot of different things too, as well, to quote unquote innovate to make sure that we're staying ahead of it, right? One of which is the fact that we're partnering with farmers that are adopting sustainable growing practices. We actually have a rating system of gold, silver, and bronze. And we have a target goal of supporting by 2030, 80% of our malt will be sustainably sourced. So pretty high target for us, but we're pretty confident that we can work with our farmers to make sure that they're adopting things that are going to be sensible for future brewers as well. At the plant, we're putting a lot of CapEx and investment into some cool technology, one of which is the combined heat and power infrastructure at our malt houses. This actually reduces our grid supplied electricity by about 80% and works similar to your heat exchanger in your brewery, right? It's a heat recapture technology and using it elsewhere in the malting process. Along with that, if you know anything about making malt, it requires a ton of water to do. All right, we fill up and drain those steeping beds, which are about 100 metric tons to 200, about 3 times. Right, so we're in beta testing for some technology called OptiSteep. This is going to recirculate and recondition that water, so that way we're not using nearly as much. Right, it reduces our water consumption about 30%, and as a byproduct, it also reduces our natural gas and electricity usage. Right. And then last but not least, kind of the most wacky one is in Calgary, we're testing out something called CarbonX technology. This is recapturing our carbon flue gas, and it's converting it into a pearl ash or a potassium carbonate. This product can actually be used in soap and cleaning products. And the incentive here is to have sort of a work stream of all byproducts that have an end destination, right? None of our byproducts are going to go to waste. They're going to go find and be something else down the line and continue that sustainable practice on that one.
If you've ever stopped by our CBC booth and you smell something really good, it's because we have bars of soap made from this. So
if
really
you smell something really bad, it's me, and I apologize.
All of us, I think.
What day of CBC are we talking?
Yeah, right.
Well, one very different.
Yeah. And lastly, Canada Malting and Country Malt, we've been recently merged with Soufflé Malt. We've come under a new parent company, but we've set ourselves some pretty high sustainable goals for the future, right? So by 2030, we're hoping to reduce our water usage by about 30%. We're trying to reduce our greenhouse gas from today's current standard by about 50%. And again, I mentioned 100% waste recovery, that every byproduct will have a purpose down the chain, right? And probably the biggest one is that we're sourcing from sustainable sources, right? 80% of our barley will be sourced from farmers that are adopting practices that are sort of protecting the earth that we use. So again, a lot of innovation, a lot of research is going into this, and it's sort of out of necessity at this point, right? And so it's a really cool world to talk about and to kind of get in. I'm sure there'll be a whole nother CBP talk, but it would be hard pressed to not mention it, here and now.
All right, and I don't know if this presentation is going to be shared out for the broad group, but I do have some resources for everyone. We've got our Brew Deck podcast, some recipes, our blog, our website. Like I said, we're a group of technical experts here at your fingertips. We have a lot of resources for you. It's lots of different things that you can choose from to get extra information from our company. All right, that is what we have for today. So
awesome.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thanks for listening. Anybody who listens in later, we really appreciate your time. And if you ever have any questions, we are here. Our doors open. Hit us up and we can definitely help you out.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.